Hello, and thank you for tuning into the European Guanxi podcast. We bring together young scholars, young professionals, and experts to strengthen the dialogue between the European Union and China and about its evolving relationship.
Fun fact, the European Guanxi is the third winner of the European Charlemagne Prize 2026, a European Parliament award that recognizes projects led by young Europeans, which foster the understanding and cooperation in Europe.
Exactly. So to dive deeper into our work, make sure to catch our episodes every 2 weeks.
Today, Kiara and myself, Ariel Cardozo Calatrava, welcome you to another episode with Simon van Oortmerssen and Marc Moquette from the China Knowledge Network. They already were here a couple times before. So first of all, thank you very much for joining us for the fourth time, Simon and Marc.
Thanks very much for having us again, and congratulations on the Charlemagne Prize. I mean, I think that's a great thing.
Yes, for sure. So, as some of you may recall, the China Knowledge Network, or CKN, is an organization funded by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs and was created to strengthen knowledge around China's evolving policies, international role, and long-term vision. It brings together more than 200 experts across policy and academia, and is here to support policymakers shaping the Sino-Dutch relationship and understanding in the shifting international order.
All right. And in today's episode, we focus on China's influence in the European seaports and discuss how the EU could respond to this influence. So I would say, let's jump right into our episode, into our first blog. Why does China's presence in European ports matter? And maybe to first give a little bit of an overview, we all know that European ports and related logistics are a crucial part of international trade and investment. And the involvement of third countries increased over the years. And this trend is driven by geopoliticalization, but also that governments really want to have an influence in foreign countries and partners. And I would say one of the most crucial actors is obviously China. And Chinese companies, many of them state-owned, have become major players in multiple European ports. The port of Hamburg in Greece, we've seen that. They facilitate, on the one hand, trade, provide investments, supply European port with the logistic companies, with the material, equipment, technology, all of that, that might sound at the beginning very promising, very beneficial, but there are also risks. So my first question to you, very broad, very general, is why would anyone outside of the shipping industry care who owns a port?
I think it's a wonderful data point to enter a discussion that is really fascinating in a way, which is very abstractly put. It's the integration of a Chinese-centered and a Western-centered system. And this is where they meet. And this is one of the contact points. There are many more. And if you're interested in this story, it's not a bad place to begin.
Yeah, at the same time, maybe to also put in another perspective, right? You could equally ask the question, why would we care about where our medicine comes from?
Mm-hmm.
Why do we care where our cars come from? And that is it's a difficult one because there's so many aspects that relate to it. But usually as a customer, I think by and large at this moment, most people care about that they get good quality product for as little money as it costs them, right? But whatever happens in the whole value chain, from the moment that they have something in their hands to where it was created, how it was created, etc., that's usually out of the concern of the customer. So maybe the question is, who is the person that should care, right? Are we talking customers or are we talking more specifically governments or companies, right? Because I think depending on who you ask the question, you will get a different answer. If there's a window in front of us that you can't see in the podcast, but people would be walking by, we could ask the question, do you care if the port is owned by the Dutch or the Germans or the Chinese or the Americans? And most likely they'll say, no, not really, as long as I get my product, right? If that's the customer on the street. So it's a very broad question. I think it depends on the person you ask the question that would give a...
Yeah. And what does it mean in general when China has authority over a certain port? What does it look like in practice?
It means In a couple of words, it means that we are interdependent as a European and Chinese states and I would say economic systems and political systems, but that every time China integrates on its own terms into the European system, the way it exists right now, it means the asymmetric dependency actually grows. And that is not to the advantage of Europe, if you look at it from a geopolitical overall viewpoint. At the same time, you should say, well, there are two ways to respond to that. You fight tooth and nail to disallow them to enter your system, or you adapt to stuff that you cannot control. I think that's a very basic question.
Okay.
So I think you've managed to highlight a little bit of the reason behind China's interest in European ports, but at what point does China's investment give China leverage over the decisions that should actually be made in Brussels or in member states?
Yeah, I think that is at many points at the same time. It happens, and it's not a linear story. I mean, every little step that China makes, in ownership of a port asset, or in better information on logistics, or in, a greater imbalance in trade, that actually adds to this asymmetry of interdependence. And that is structural. Like if, in energy systems, in industry systems, I mean, these are changing globally. And that's one part of the story. Another part is also that this is happening very locally. So, for example, if you see Chinese acquiring higher levels of ownership on port systems like in Greece in comparison with Germany or the Netherlands, this creates, in the abstract, local interests that will actually, without China doing anything, will lobby higher up in the nation state or in the European system to avoid needless, unnecessary antagonism with China. And at the same time, what happens is that the chances on EU unison in response to China diminish because of that. So it's not a problem in and of itself. It is the accumulation of little steps that is changing the situation. And that is also why I think security policy is in a way eating its way into industrial policy, into market logics. And that's why, there's an ever grander sphere that is being securitized in the relation with China. At the same time, China itself is coming from a background where it's very difficult to change its behavior. China has its own difficulties in trying to get ahead. And the way it integrated into the world economy up to now was greatly pushed by how they organized their own regulations. So they didn't integrate in our system. They built their own. And they put rules into the system that they could defend in China itself. And it's only a logical outcome of these two systems trying to integrate that China is doing everything possible to have its system be accepted outside of its own state. Like China has a trilemma in a way. It wants to grow. It needs to be dynamic nationally, economically. It wants to integrate in this global economy for which it's fighting over the rules. And it wants to retain national control. And this trilemma is not specific to China. The details are specific to China because Europe and the United States face the same trilemma in a way.
And would you say the acquisition of European ports then also counts within China gaining a more global dominant role or selling its?
Yes, I think that's clear. I mean, and it's not for in and of itself pernicious reasons. It's a market and state logic. Okay. The problem and the challenge is that we're really in a situation of systemic rivalry where China, in a nutshell, is applying its, I would say, state-centric capitalist system. And we are still working under the legacy of a supra-state capitalist system that is not delivering the stuff that it used to deliver for us. So there's also for us a need to adapt to that.
Maybe, Ariel, to go back to your question, right? As an additional point of view, I think you asked at what moments does China gain leverage, right, over a port,
right.
whether depending on its ownership or stakeholdership in a given port. I think if you take a few steps back, right, the first step being that I think there was a European official who recently characterized the trade relationship between Europe and China as there's a 400-meter long container ship departing from China carrying 24,000 containers. It offloads in Europe and it goes back empty. Right? The 300 billion trade imbalance. Now, the very practical question is, where do these 24,000 containers get offloaded? Now, if you're a harbor, I think your business model is to on and offload goods. Irrespective of who owns the harbor, that's your business model.
That's right.
So just by the sheer volume and the current structure of the trade, as China has the volume, it can ask which port anywhere in the world, anywhere in Europe, because we all have relatively good connections with the rest of Europe internally, would like to offload my 24,000 containers. And based on that discussion, you will be the one that gets the containers to offload and redistribute.
Yeah.
So even if you don't have an ownership as China of a port or an interest in a port, just by having the market, right, and you bring the ships, you bring the goods, you're the demandeur, right, in this situation. So that's the first step back. You don't have to actually control a percentage of a certain terminal or whole port in order to be able to direct influence. I think if you take a step back from that, is why are we in the situation here and that China ships 24,000 containers to Europe and it goes back empty? That is that China has for a long time had the strategy to become a manufacturing hub, right? The made in China has worked really hard and it's doing it now. As long as they are the player of this scale in the field, then from using market forces, like I have a ship with the 24,000 containers and no one else has a ship, I determine the rules, right? In that sense, I set the market. So if you start to unpack it in that way, you go to the question, okay, so how this happened to be, right? And what other factors are in play? That becomes maybe a bit too hard to unpack in one answer to your question, but just to clarify that owning a certain percentage in one of the many ports in Europe in this particular case doesn't necessarily mean that that's your only lever of influence, right? That's
Would you also argue that it's also part of this process of let's call it image washing? That this conceptualization of China as being effective, efficient. So in terms of ports, I think this is very important. So the fact that maybe Chinese state-backed companies own most of these ports and are able to bring their technology and efficiency, do you think this enhances their image in Europe in this case?
As far as I understand port business, and I'm not an expert here, is that ships make money when they transport goods, not when they're lying idle in a port or in front of a port, right? That's a demurrage cost. That only costs money. So for a shipper and a transporter, the more optimal you use your ship to be actually transporting goods across the sea, the quicker you'll be able to unload and offload your goods when you are at a port at the lowest possible berth cost, right? That optimizes your business model, right? And maximizes the money you get in return. So if you have an advantage in whether you're China or any other place in the world, to do that quicker, right? That is attractive for anyone who is in this business, fundamentally, unless we change the premises of the business model.
Yeah. Well, I think they're on the table, the premises of the business model, because this is market logic. This is an agent in an economic system. If we would agree, the US, the EU, China, Africa, Brazil, everybody on the market rules, this would be competition. And we would be in the quadrant where we are very much collaborating because we agree on the rules, and we're competing because within those rules, we all accept that we have to live up to them. The challenge is, of course, that this is not the case in our relationship with China, and increasingly no longer the case in our relationship with the United States. So Europe finds itself in a G2 world, and it has to balance all these pressure points and these asymmetric interdependencies, because, decoupling or de-risking, I think that is very difficult. It's a very different discussion. But if you accept the idea that we are integrated.
Also, I think I would say it's very difficult to define what exactly the strategy is.
In all instances, I'm afraid, because the point I try to make in responding to what Simon just said, which is the strict market approach, which has a very strong logic to it, and it weighs very heavily in our relation. That is that there are cascading effects, knock-on effects from these market transactions, from the market strength, the amount of control you have over the market. And then you come in a very serious discussion on what markets are. And we used to think differently about markets. Now that we are on the wrong end of the market power, we are changing actually the definition of what a market is. And we are trying to defend the political organization of global markets. And like a port is not just this node where these goods come together. It is a layered structure. There's information. There's customs interface. There's the hinterland. There is an energy base with a specific profile, which is either electric or fossil. There are many. There is a bioregional context at play there, and what China is really great in doing is to organize the vertical integration of these. Whereas Europe has a very different model. It's way more distributed. It's way more following this market logic under the assumption of this agreement over the rules. And, we have a legacy problem. We have to adapt to the sheer power of this different logic, which is not just ideological. It's just the industrial power of China. And otherwise, we will lose our own industrial power. We're deindustrializing at this moment.
And in a certain way, sorry to interrupt you, Kiara, but ports are like a liminal space, right? And you're in a number of zones between different systems, between the land system and the sea system, right?
Yeah.
Where you do the goods by train or road or over sea. It's also a liminal space in where technologies and cultures meet, right? Yeah. Because your ship needs to somehow offload your goods in another space, right? And there's duties and imports and maybe all the other aspects that Marc just mentioned. So it is natural that there where the two ecologies meet in that liminal space, that there's intermingling, you get evolution, and things are not as in the middle of those ecosystems, right? So it becomes a touchy space in the sense that new things happen, and that is full of, as they say, risks and full of rewards. And that's an interesting zone, right? But that's why I think ports in that sense also are at the forefront of many of in this particular case, the EU-China relations when it comes to trade, right?
Yeah, I think it's remarkable of how we sort of structure it so far, that we see that maybe the problem or the issue of Chinese or European dependence on China materializes within European ports, but the problem behind or the way how it comes to this dependency is way broader and has also ideological roots, and as you described, is interconnected with the entire global trade. And you were also mentioned strategic interdependence, asymmetry between China and the EU. And I think voices, especially French voices in the EU, are very loud in establishing a more reciprocal relationship.
Yes.
If China now acquires a European port, what does the EU do? Does the EU do the same in China?
No, and it can't yet.
Yes.
And France, of course, if I can cut a few corners, is the most state capitalist country in the European Union. So I'm not surprised. And also, France is playing this role, and I can understand it from its history and its economic structure, its political practice, everything, which is the beauty of Europe, that we have 27 polished diamonds, each and all in their own logic, but very difficult to put in a nice composition in the crown of the European unity. And so France is the example of one example of a type of exposure to China risk, to US risk, and to European integration risk, which is very different from Germany, which is also very different from the frugal Nordics and the Dutch and the Belgians, that are more like clinging together because of their common interest in Europe in integrating. And France takes a different view. It has always done. And Germany is in a very different situation in its energy-based. And so these are the fault lines within the European Union. And that is the main reason why we are not capable of returning the favor to China as they treat us. And China knows this. It's not their problem. It's our challenge. And that's also, maybe we have to apologize for that, Simon and I, because we have a vocabulary that systematically pushes the discussion away from territorial, corporate, geopolitical analysis and immediate interest, and towards a better and deeper understanding of systemic relations and how we should adapt and what possibilities for adaptation there are. And this is basically the difference between short-term and long-term approach, between zooming in on the urgent action that has to be organized right now and understanding where the hell we are, not just as France or as the Netherlands or China, but how we are embedded with all these relations in complex adaptive systems where China and Europe and the US paradoxically face the same challenge. So, I mean, this is just a different perspective. And I think it's one of the achievements of the China Knowledge Network that we try also to translate this into a political approach and a policy approach, which is tough stuff and the subject of another podcast.
No, but what struck me in your answer that you said that Europe is not ready to exert influence or even buy parts of Chinese ports yet. Could you elaborate more on that? What would Europe need, or what are the problems in that regard?
Well, I think the simplest answer is that would require a degree of unity, political unity and decision-making, where Europe has to, like the Baron von Munchausen, pull itself out of the morass, out of bootstrapping itself. And the challenge, it's not that we can't do it, but the political challenge is that any unified European approach, it doesn't matter which one you choose, has an asymmetrical cost. I mean, some states will have to pay more, and they would like to compensate. So, I mean, and we're quibbling in the European Union, about who is going to contribute this and who has to be compensated for that, and like, is the Netherlands supposed to pay for nuclear protection of the French force de frappe? No, that's a different column. So we organize that differently. We fragment this in such a way that the European unity remains stable, and that stops us from a unitary position to China. Now, however, I should ask, even if the EU would be achieving this totally unitary position, which is a figment of my imagination now, China would not allow it, because China uses rules that it has developed, that it had good reasons to develop, and that worked. I mean, China did not opt to embrace the international legal order and then just receive investments from the US and Europe and live happily ever after. No, China is the only developing country that became an emerging market, that knew how to avoid the poverty trap, that escaped the shock therapy that the West has applied to some other countries. I'm not going into details now. So China had reasons. And I think where China now stands is, in a way, the proof that in a different approach, you can develop. And the way Europe is now organizing, because China is so successful, is the proof that what we have before espoused as, your developmental model to other countries, we now throw away because we see for ourselves that it doesn't work that way. And I think that the best proof of that is the speech for the World Economic Forum of the Canadian Prime Minister.
Carney.
Marc Carney, saying, we live in the rupture, and it's and you cannot integrate into a system if that becomes the start of your own demise. I'm rephrasing him, I'm paraphrasing him. And I think that's where France can teach a couple of things to the European Union, but obviously Germany, for example, has a very different background and a very different interest, and has an industry that is greatly dependent on collaborating and integrating with Chinese industry, because just one example, Volkswagen is now just supplanting all its production lines for the EVs that they produce to China. So they don't want the European Union to high the tariffs.
And maybe as a follow-up and complementary perspective to what Marc just gave, if we roll with the analogy of the 24,000 container ship going to Europe and going back empty, why would any European company or nation want to have a stake in a Chinese port if there's no goods there to ship, right? So that, this is a black and white, very crude comparison, but there needs to be a logic. That's one. Is there a commercial drive to do so? Second, and I don't have the data, and maybe you two have, I know that I think China holds an interest in about 35 ports in Europe, usually a minority stake in a terminal within a bigger port system. The only exception is Piraeus. We might touch upon that later.
Exactly.
I have no clue how ownership of Chinese ports looks like and or terminals thereof, and if there's actually any European or American or other companies that have stakes in Chinese harbors. And maybe that's the other perspective I wanted to add, other than the market's perspective, and that's the historical perspective where if you look at Chinese history, the century of humiliation started with the unequal port treaties. I think that puts a very, you point directly to a sore spot where historically Chinese were not very pleasantly surprised or with the whole situation, how that went down, right? So that might also form the historical reasons why, and again, I don't have the data at this moment, the option for a reciprocal investment in ports is maybe not as on the table as people would want it. So there's quite a few reasons, right? And it's not easy to give straightforward answers here, but it's good to keep these in mind.
Marc, you said earlier, unity is the way to go. Do you think, or don't you think that because the EU has a motto of united in diversity, that different member states' perceptions, for example, Germany adopting a more cooperative approach, the Netherlands maybe watching more over human rights, could actually be a catalyzer to engage on multiple levels with China? Instead of, for example, because now I'm thinking if we need a unified approach, we need to find a compromise. And compromise between 27 member states means always a watered down resolution because you need to compromise on the lowest common denominator. Would you also consider that, for example, that the EU can streamline its different approaches through different member states more effectively without taking a unified approach?
Yes, I think it's a bit paradoxical, but I think you hit the nail on the head. Because unified doesn't necessarily mean that you are centralist and one decision has to cover all problems. No, obviously, I think the strength of the European Union, and also I think this is a very deep-seated strength, how you deal with diversity and whether that is a force or a threat, is perceived very differently in China and in Europe. It doesn't mean that China is a totalitarian centralizing state and stops there, because it has actually quite a machinery dealing with complexity from which Europe can learn a lot. That's also another podcast. But it does mean that Europe has to adapt how actually this unison is going to be organized. It has to become more tolerant for the ambiguity between all these member states. But at the same time, it has to have a kernel, a core of action where they should be less ambiguous. And I think the Commission is trying to fight for this. There's a lot of politics. Politics is also always local around who gets to say what. It is behind closed doors. There's no public discussion on it, except maybe in some academic quarters or some podcasts. And that is actually, I think, the most difficult question. I paraphrase here. It's a quote we often use from our lab. It's like the real question Europe has to ask is, who do we want to become? It's not complaining about China and pointing at China. It is talking to your own monsters and your own legacy, and where that doesn't work anymore. And it's not geopolitics, it's more systemic adaptation. And Europe really has to become more serious about its own systemic adaptation.
Let's maybe remain in this member states divide to the European unity. Who are the different groups that actually adopt different stances on China? And I think we can elaborate on three different groups that have three different stances on China. So
yes, firstly, the so-called urgency group. So, of course, consisting of countries such as the Netherlands, Poland, and Belgium, which regard Chinese involvement in ports and logistics as a security threat that requires EU-level coordination to some extent.
Then we have the second group, Germany and France. We already touched upon them, and we touched upon their differences. But I think what both countries have in common is that they are more cautious about their own national industries and therefore prefer to adopt the national stance and engage with China more on a domestic level.
And thirdly, there is this more open group, that's what they call it, consisted of southern countries such as Greece, Italy, and Spain that do not see Chinese investment as a priority security issue. So given this EU internal divides, could you maybe please zoom in into these dynamics within different groups and how they approach Chinese port politics in Europe?
I think
that's a broad question.
well, actually, it for me it echoes the distinction that we were discussing before. That I refer to frugals. That's basically the main group as your first group.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, why are they frugal and why are they concerned about the security issue of Chinese investments, and why do they want more centralized authority in the Commission to deal with the threat? It's because they're small in the European Union. Of course, we are Dutch. So we're the biggest of the smallies, or the smallest of the biggies, whatever, we're somewhere in between. A bit like the adolescent in the room. And we understand instinctively, as states, and also our corporations understand instinctively, that if we move towards, upscaling industrial capacity and backing the winners and everything that China is doing, if we would copy that, we run the risk of, I would say, corporate whitewashing of resilience, because we have to become more resilient.
Mm-hmm.
We have to organize Europe around that. And then the first instinct is, okay, we need big corporations because we have to compete with the Americans, with the Chinese. There's a lot of truth in it, but the small partners in the European Union that have an open orientation towards the global economy because they depend on it, they see themselves first as member of the European market that has to integrate.
Mm-hmm.
And they see for themselves very little opportunity if Europe is going to back the winners, because it means the end of the smallies. So, that's an instinctive part of, I think, the approach towards Chinese-European relations and the role of the Commission in your distinction between these three groups. And the third group, saving Germany and France for last, for the dessert, the third group is a group of countries that has a totally different exposure to China risk. You mentioned Spain, Greece. Well, Greece, obviously, that's a story apart, which really touches also on why Europe has to look into its own adaptation process and look its own monsters straight into the face. Because there's a whole story about the financial crisis and what happened to Greece that we're not going to unpack now. But that is the real reason why the Chinese got their foothold in Greece. And that's something where we have an internal tension in what we do with the euro, with our how we deal financial crises, and how the euro states in the European Union keep order. And their prospects, and that's the second reason why it's important to understand what this third group, why it's set apart, is that their prospects to integrate in the European economy are not that good. We have a long history of pretending that this whole euro is there to have an economic integration of the union, but it's not happening. And politically, we're avoiding the subject. So, that sets the third group apart. And then Hungary is also a case apart. Now we have changed political leadership, but there you see the reflection of quite objective changes in interest and differences in interest between these countries.
And I think we see also changes from within. For example, Italy, first joining the Belt and Road Initiative 21, then exiting again in 23. So it's...
No, there's a whole dynamic per state in this in this game, and then saving, France and Germany for the last. I mean, they're the biggies in the European Union. They're the axis. Their relationship is more strained than before. They have to be more creative and dig deeper to keep the European Union going. This is happening, but they also both face severe political risk in their own constitutional system and in their own political stability internally. France, also debt levels in France rise very rapidly. And if France becomes the next Greece, that's really a change of game.
Yeah.
And Germany also, it has to adapt from an energetic economic banking system that worked wonderfully for a long time, but Germany has lost its mojo. And this is translated in new, I would say, political balance. And maybe the last point I would like to make is that there is hovering above these three groups. There is a real fundamental choice between what we're going to do with Europe, how we're going to balance the Commission and the member states, and how we're going to organize stability, whereas real wages Europe-wide have not particularly been growing. So there's a real challenge there. And this is a recipe for a political, let's say, mounting tensions, and they have to be controlled. So that's also the danger of a very unitary European approach. That is a sort of drift towards a more authoritarian approach, because otherwise we won't make it. And this is politics. So I'll stop here.
And that's right. That's right. I mean, yeah, something.
No, I was thinking as Marc was explaining that I'm not intimately familiar with the three groupings that you just described. So I can't have much on that. But as we were talking, I was sort of reflecting in terms of ports, right, and how different countries might have different ideas. I don't have the data on how much European countries use maritime seaports to ship goods to other European countries. Right? Does Greece ship its goods to the Netherlands via going through the Mediterranean and then the Atlantic and the North Sea to end here in Rotterdam or Amsterdam? Or is it loaded on container trucks and do they drive? Right? So depending on how that flow looks internally within Europe, you have a different exposure. And for the Netherlands, I do have some data points that would say, for example, that we import roughly 1 billion worth of goods from China every year. The interesting point for me there is that less than half of that stays in the Netherlands. More than half of that is immediately transported to the rest of Europe. Right? So the 100 billion is enough money to look at that from a number of angles, including national security, because it is a shitload of money. Forgive my European. And secondly, it shows that the Netherlands has a particular role and function which might be different from a lot of other countries that have less import and less throughput to Europe. So I think it would be interesting to look at the data behind this and also answer that question from that angle, just from an economical flow point of view, right? I'm totally in agreement with Marc that there's way more different forces that are historically shaped, politically shaped, culturally shaped, that drive this debate. So again, it's not straightforward.
No,
in my
definitely.
mind.
Yeah.
That's true. I think, therefore, we kind of conclude that Chinese involvement in European ports differs depending on the member states in Europe, and which also leads to the politicization of this topic. We've already touched a little bit upon the dynamics in the different groups of member states, but there are two important examples here that we've kind of mentioned before, but we could go and dive deeper on them and compare them. So first of all, there's a port in Greece, Piraeus, where COSCO holds over 67% of port authority and full ownership of the container in the Piraeus container terminal.
Yeah, and then on the other hand, the German port Hamburg, which only holds 25% of the port authority after Germany really pushed back Chinese investments and plans. So how do you explain this difference? I mean, maybe as a little reminder, Greece belonged to the very open group and Germany to the more national focus group.
And Germany was more frugal, they say, and
Yeah.
Greece had a different tradition,
Yeah.
they say.
Slightly less frugal. No, I mean, the frugality factor, I think, plays a big role, but there are more. I remember that previous Bundeskanzler actually had to correct his own Minister for Economic Affairs in Germany because he was more tolerant for higher investment levels. And we were smiling in the China Knowledge Network because we had previously issued a report which we commissioned to a very interesting research party called Datena. And we had just issued the report and we had deep discussions. How high can we accept these investment levels? And we just arrived at 24.9%. So, which was slightly under 25. But so we smiled that actually the same logic was being applied without us communicating with each other. And that is like the frugal logic. And it's also, you don't want to block Chinese investments. You need to integrate, but we have to be careful on the terms. So that's very basic. Greece is a very totally different situation. It's not the frugality, I think, even though that depends on how you look at their spending history. But when the economic crisis came, and we had the euro crisis in Greece with Varoufakis as the finance minister, there's a very famous episode in how European unity, when push comes to shove, is being organized. And so there was a blunt refusal of any debt forgiveness, or it was, we have to repay the banks. So you either take these loans with the package of reforms, or you're out and you can't be out. So that is a very tough line of conversation, which ultimately led the Greek finance minister to step down. And so what we did is we opened with claiming to have a single Europe, but we followed a financial banking logic and not a geopolitical one. Because, the minute after, well, the story is slightly more complicated, but let's reduce it. The minute after, the Chinese were there and they could do anything they liked because we actually asked the Greeks to privatize the assets. And this is what has been done.
Yeah.
So in a way, Europe has organized its own challenges this way. And it's definitely not repeatable, I think. I think we will not do it another time. But if the financial crisis hits, then we will see.
Exactly. And in essence, Piraeus is an outlier, right? As far as I understand, where China indeed holds part of the port authority, not the interest of a certain percentage in a terminal.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting data point to contrast.
Another follow-up, if we were in the same situation, but right now without the financial crisis, would you say that Greece acted differently or would now act differently?
Well, there's also change of government, so I think they would.
Yeah, okay.
But it's not just the political color. I think it's also a more in-depth understanding of how Europe should organize itself. And that's what we come back to the question we put on the table before. It's the key question is, who do we want to become as Europe? And how are we going to organize that? Which is political, again, especially in the face of China, that is no longer just a country. It's a systemic actor. It's part of the complex adaptive systems. And that's asking us adaptation, not just stoppage or defense. We also need a more offensive approach to keep on integrating while adapting on both sides. And that also asks for a slightly different diplomacy.
I think another one is, so China owns stakes in, I think, about 78 ports in Africa, which is about 1/3 of all the ports in Africa. I don't know what, that's just counting ports, right? I don't know what the sort of the volumes on annual basis are. If you compare that with Europe, with the 35 ports, that's about 1/10 of Europe's ports, right? Again, I don't know what the volume is in container transfer, the other.
Mm.
So clearly there is a complete difference in scale of what China's port strategy means for Africa compared to what China's port strategy means for Europe.
Mm.
Yeah. If I again flip that question back to us in Europe, what is our port strategy in Africa? And how does that link to the global gateway? And how does that stack up to the global gateway?
No comparison.
The BRI.
And I think there's a difference in scale, as you say. There's also the difference in structure. I mean, in China, investment in infrastructure has diminishing returns now. I mean, they just put everything in place they need, basically. And so there's a big interest to integrate in this global economy through infrastructural investments, because they can really deliver bang for your buck.
Yep.
Europe can't. We're too expensive. We're, our labor is not there. We have very high-tech solutions, Chinese too, but that simply do not find buyers. If you want to do infrastructure projects and you look at Africa, Brazil, Turkey, China, others are players there. But the European companies are not as well represented in that field. And that's a bit of a paradox. If you want to spend 300 billion on global investments, I think it goes also beyond Africa, what Europe is doing. And you look at what China has already spent, which is over $1 trillion, I think, in the BRI. It's already been invested, it's placed capital. That's a scale difference, and it's a structural difference. So we will not be able to compete with that BRI because of the structure of our own economy and the services we can deliver and the prices we ask.
So it might not only be a matter of the external restraints that the European Union might have, but how it responds to that.
Yes.
Yeah, we talked about European unity, but what is actually on the table? What are the existing instruments that the EU is currently deploying? Maybe you can name a few.
Yeah, just to name off the top of my head, obviously FDI screening, obviously export controls.
Yeah.
In the wider game, this is not just about ports, but it's about the ecosystem for protection. The Industry Acceleration Act, which is basically copycatting China. I mean, we just want to have more protections for our European industry. So we now say buy European, and we don't allow any and everyone that is on the global market to compete. And this is basically mirroring China. And I think the real bazooka that we have as an instrument, but that we have not yet used,
Anti-coercion instrument,
is the anti-coercion instrument. Exactly. And China is banking very much, and perhaps the United States as well, because this is a generic instrument. They are banking on the fact that it's a bazooka that is really very dangerous, but it has no trigger. So who cares if you have a bazooka, but you can't shoot? And Europe has not used this bazooka because it really would give us, if we would use it and apply it, it would give Europe maximum opportunity to organize its economic defense. So beyond the other instruments that I mentioned. But we can't trigger it because of the discussion that we had before, because we're too divided and because of the asymmetry in the cost if we apply it. And then European countries would have some kind of correction mechanism internally in place before to trigger the bazooka. It is just too complicated.
Because we need unanimity in the council, or what are the procedures?
Yeah, I don't know exactly the procedures, but I do know that we have stood before. Many times the European Commission was advised by think tanks or by nation states to organize the application of the instruments. Because we are giving our data, where China can just also in how China blocks the export of rare earth elements, and we are dependent on that. And now we have to deliver a lot of information that are very intimate about our companies to China Customs Services, so that they can then allow that we get a portion of these rare earth elements. This is obviously creating a lot of concern in Europe, and this is a basic tenet of our industrial policies for defense, for anything we produce. It comes on top of losing market share in a very rapid pace. If you look 20 years back, China had 3% of chemics and 3% in certain economic sectors, they now boomed to 20, 30%, even of the European markets and global markets. And Europe is dwindling in the range of 50 to 20%. And that's slightly overstating the case, but not much. And this is a trend. So we have to stop this trend. So the jury for me is out that Europe somehow, if the pressure mounts, apparently it has not mounted high enough yet, but if it will be still higher, and perhaps just before the laptop class is finding the weaponry in their gardens and professing a revolution in Europe, just before that point, Europe will act and will perhaps respond very strongly.
I think in that context, throughout this episode as a whole, we have kind of identified main issues that characterize this or define the nature of European port politics in that sense. So maybe the first one, as the beginning of this episode, was about increasing foreign involvement in European ports, with special emphasis on China, of course. Second of all, we slightly moved into internal vertical and horizontal fragmentation within the European Union. And thirdly, dispersed set of policy instruments that are not yet brought together into a more coherent and comprehensive approach. So upon these challenges, what is currently missing to overcome these sector-specific structural weaknesses? And in that context, why does the report argue that a specific European strategic framework for seaports and port-related logistics is needed? And what should its main purpose be?
Again, I'll go with the analogy of the body, right? Think of Europe as a cell. And ports are like the parts in the membrane where you can exchange goods. If the cell is Europe, it'd be pretty weird if half of your membranes let in things that are not sensible and the other ones don't.
Yeah.
So I think you're referring to the report written by the China Knowledge Network
Exactly.
A while ago, which indeed argued for a comprehensive, harmonized European way of looking at ports. If I look at it from my simplified metaphors perspective, it makes total sense.
Yeah.
And it also, I think it makes total sense beyond the metabolism and the data that we all know. And when we look at it, we know we have to act. But it makes also total sense because it will enable Europe, I would say more its own mindscape, to make things more predictable, to build trust among member states and the Commission. And that we know that there is going to be compensation if certain member states really lose out or have to make 180-degree turnarounds because they've invested under a different logic. We have to apply solidarity there as well if you're a European Union. And it's not solidarity purely out of selflessness. It is also solidarity out of self-interest, because if we don't do it, there are bigger entities that will just eat us alive. So I think that's a hopeful.
We are interconnected, right? Unless we will become an autarkic system as Europe, right? Completely self-contained, self-sufficient.
Pretty different.
We will have to interact with that which is outside of Europe.
Yeah.
And that's going to be road, it's going to be air, and it's going to be water.
Yeah. And maybe one more addition is also that framework should be in place, but not in isolation. It should be politicized, and in such a way, not only to allow for solidarity to flow between the member states, but I think also to assist member states and the Commission in understanding this complex adaptive system of which they are a part, and actually to develop the type of knowledge that is not just focusing on the urgencies that we are here for to protect our geopolitical interests, but also on the important aspects of a bit more long-term, a bit more abstract, a bit less local, of how we can actually orient ourselves in these complex systems. And that's not a European question. That's a question also for diplomacy in our relation with the Chinese, with the Americans, with the Africans. And that's a different question. Normally, we would simply cut that in two as we fragment politics. That's our habit. And we would say that's development policies or that's climate policies. And we would separate it from geopolitics. We have to do the dirty stuff, the important stuff, and we don't communicate. I think we've passed the age and the maturity level where we can still permit ourselves to just fragment this politically for short-term national purposes. And we should integrate that knowledge. And that's really a knowledge challenge. It's not a political challenge. It means opening up a European space and a global space where we treat these questions in a multilateral setting, but differently from how we organized them in the past.
So to sum up, we need a European strategic framework that unifies all member states but acknowledges the difference between them, that is specific to seaports but also integrated in the broader geopolitical world, international arena.
Yeah, I think, and we should not overburden. Because we should not overburden single issue things. I think we should have this framework and take care of the other data points and mental points that we have to bring together in Europe, so that it remains cohesive, coherent, and that it really offers a sense of orientation that we do not have right now.
And maybe in that context, and maybe to sum up a little bit, what roles do the individual member states, maybe of these different groups or categories that we highlighted before, and the institutions can play in order to push this forward?
So I think one part of the answer is take a reflection on the complexity of these relations way more seriously politically than we do now. That's one part. And the other part is, of course, also it's a part of attitude, of leadership quality. You can call it anything you want, which is political leadership that is able to transcend short-term incentives in national politics, and that sees also the systemic opportunity for Europe, what we can win if this unity in diversity can be organized. And that should be a positive narration, a story, and that should be also shared publicly, which is not being done right now. We have a very securitized weaponization of infrastructure. Where Europe is heading right now is very clear, but I think also a mounting concern for a lot of voters.
Yeah, exactly. Just to maybe harp on that point, it was just reflecting in my mind that it's also about having skin in the game, right? And skin in the game in the political game, but the electorate, the people of Europe, also have skin in the game. To hark back to the very first question, why should anyone care whether a port is owned by the Chinese or the Dutch here in the Netherlands, right? As an example. Voters will, once it starts to hurt, right, they will mobilize as well. They will ask for things as well. So that skin in the game is going to come, right? The pressure in that sense is on. I think the four of us in this room seem to agree that Europe has some challenges, or let's say some aspirations to work on. And Europe is not the only one. We're not a continent in isolation. We all still are on one planet. That's right. We're still working on the same climate, right? Which, by the way, up to a very large degree, fertilizes the land, grows the food, right? It provides the raw materials and thereby enables the whole economic infrastructure, which is the blood that flows through the heart of ports. So we all have a very clear skin in the game, which when we just talked about earlier, most consumers don't feel yet because they don't care as long as the product is there and it's cheap and it's affordable. But once the products are no longer there, or once they become very unaffordable, then it becomes skin in the game for anyone in their status quo, in their well-being. Now, if I would be it's not easy to be in the seat of a politician, but Marc just talked about the long-term anchoring, the long-term direction, right? For Europe, this is very much an issue as well. At European level, at national country level, pick a random European country that doesn't have strong local challenges it needs to work on that are, once we start unpacking them, we'll find out they're related to ports as well. China.
In a nutshell, maybe, don't get us wrong. We have to securitize our position. But if we want to organize for the systemic adaptation that is on the table, we can't make it by just securitizing our position. We have to do more.
All right. Thank you very much for this perfect conclusive statement and for your honest reactions. I feel this episode has really shown us again that the European ports cannot be regarded in isolations, but it's all part of a broader geopolitical strategy that China already has, the EU needs to deploy.
Yeah, what emerges quite clearly here is that we're not simply witnessing simple investment or acquisition of key ports, but rather than Europe really needs to learn how to navigate and balance such challenges. And I think this episode has shown once again that the EU needs to overcome the disparities and learn how to deploy a more comprehensive and coherent strategy in its external affairs.
So, Simon, Marc, thank you very much for joining us once again. It was a pleasure to record that episode with you today.
Thanks for having us.
And for everyone else, thank you for tuning in. And if you enjoyed this episode, as always, make sure to follow the European on Sea podcast. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.